regulator community, both from USDA-ARS, APHIS, I'm sorry. And thank you, Mike. And finally, a third one from the regulated, if you will, from AgroSciences. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to bring the first speaker up. It's Mike Firko, who's the Deputy Administrator for the Biotechnology Regulatory Services, USDA-APHIS. And the title is USDA's Current Thinking on Regulatory Revisions for Biotech Plants and Plant Pathogens.
Thank you. He's going to hold us strictly to that 20 minutes, so I'm going to move right along. In 1986, the federal government published what's known as a coordinated framework for the regulation of biotechnology. Some basic tenets that were published by the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the Executive Office of the President were: the risks of GE organisms are no different from the risks from organisms created with other techniques that have the same traits, i.e., risk is not created by genetic engineering, but risk can be created by adding traits to organisms. Secondly, the existing laws provide adequate authority. So what that means is that Congress has never written a law about regulating the products of biotechnology. The first one was actually, I guess the President signed last week, a disclosure law regarding products of genetic engineering in food items, but there are no laws written by Congress about regulating the products of biotechnology per se. And the regulation should be science-based and conducted on a case-by-case basis. In other words, organisms that have been genetically engineered should be considered case-by-case to look at any risks that might be present. Now, the coordinated framework is made up primarily of 3 federal agencies, and each is shown here, and their authorities in USDA. Our authority on the plant and plant pest side is to protect plant health. FDA, safe use in food and feed. EPA, safe use as a pesticide. In our current regulations, now, I'm going to be talking about where we would like to go with our future regulations. This is about our current regulations right now. The regulatory trigger, which means you have to get a permit to import, move interstate, or plant it out of doors, or use it out of doors if it's a microorganism or an arthropod or something like that. The first trigger is you have to have altered it using recombinant DNA techniques. And secondly, there's a possibility that the GE organism is a plant pest. And the way that plant pestiness was envisioned to come from in 1987 was that the organism that has been genetically engineered was produced using plant pest either as a donor of genetic material, a vector of genetic material, or the genetically engineered organism is a plant pest itself. And then the catch-all is, or if there's otherwise a reason to believe that the organism is a plant pest. Now let me go back up. The bulk of what we have regulated over the last 3 decades is plants, and it's plants that have been genetically engineered by using disarmed Agrobacterium tumefaciens as a vector of genetic material. There's been a lot of donor, but primarily we're regulating things now and requiring permits because people used disarmed Agrobacterium to shuttle genetic information into a plant. Now, the definition of plant pest from the Plant Protection Act, which is our authorizing legislation, all those things that you're all familiar with, not just microorganisms, but also non-human animals. This shows a list of the different plants that have been granted non-regulated status over the past 3 decades. Typically, the way it works for plants is that someone will have genetically engineered a plant using a plant pest. They come to us. They have to have a permit to field trial it out of doors. They're regulated for some number of years, and then they come to us and they say, you know, I used agro to transform this plant, but I don't think that turned this plant into a bacterium. Can I stop being regulated? And that's what our decision is based on. Did you exacerbate a plant pest risk or create a plant pest risk when you genetically engineered the plant? So we have granted non-regulated status 123 times. This shows the sorts of things. It's 17 different species. On the left side in green show the ones that are very actively commercialized right now. You probably know that over 90% of corn, cotton, soy is all genetically engineered. A very high proportion of the sugar beet industry uses genetically engineered organisms. I'm showing there potato and apple because those are two relatively new ones in the yellow category. They're in minor commercial production. They will be moving to market soon, apparently. Now, I just wanted to comment that we are actively engaged in several different new breeding technologies. This shows that we started working with various nucleases in 2006. Now, these are items that are under regulation, and they are under regulation because a plant pest was involved in these processes, whether it be tailing CRISPR or zinc finger. You see that zinc fingers have been very popular, but the popularity has gone down a little recently. CRISPRs, we've been working on CRISPRs for 5 years. In 15, we had about 60 permit authorizations involving CRISPRs. CRISPRs and these new breeding technologies are interesting because we have this process in biotechnology regulatory services where if someone has genetically engineered an organism, regardless of whether it's a plant or a plant pest, but they don't think it's subject to our regulations, they write us a letter before they have requested a permit and ask us the question, according to the protocols that are on our website, am I regulated? Is this thing a regulated article? And our answers are, the legal part of our answer is, does it meet the strict definition of a regulated article in our regulations? And even though we have not incorporated any noxious weed authority into our current regulations, as an APHIS deputy administrator, I have a responsibility to protect U.S. agriculture from weeds. So we look at the weediness, and since we have no regulatory authority under our biotech regs right now, if I find something in one of these letters that raises a weediness concern, I work with plant protection and quarantine within APHIS, and we deal with it as needed. Most of these inquiries that we get are because folks did not use agro or any of these other plant pest sequences that are used in genetic engineering, and they've used some of these new techniques like TALEN and CRISPR. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to have this little piece here is that it starts to project our current thinking. We recently answered 2 letters that used CRISPR technology. This was a waxy corn and a white button mushroom. And in both cases, they used a plant pest as part of the CRISPR, but the end product is a null segregant. And our answer was, no, you're not regulated. So in the future, we're going to try to think much more carefully about, does this product create a plant pest risk, and not worry so much about how it was created. It caused a bit of a stir because everybody's all freaky about CRISPR right now. The Director of National Intelligence for the United States has listed CRISPR as a dual-use technology, which means a potential weapon of bioterrorism. So we wanted to project that when it comes to these scientific and risk issues, we're perfectly willing to take as objective a look as possible and only regulate those things that represent a risk to plant health. So to revised regulations, I'm very fortunate that we have very strong support from Secretary Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture. He has given us approval to go ahead and start moving towards new regulations. USDA's top line messages is the Biotech regulatory program for the last 30 years. EPA, FDA, USDA has done a good job of protecting the United States, but science is changing very rapidly. Our regulations are 29 years old. It's time for new regulations after 29 years. Well, there it is. Our regulations are written in '87. We had a new statute in 2000. I mean, we write regulations, but we can only write regulations pursuant to a statute written by Congress. In 2000, Congress gave us a new statute. Our original regulations in 1987 were written pursuant to the Federal Plant Pest Act, and then the Plant Protection Act in 2000. We have never updated our regulations under this new statutory authority. We want to focus on risk, not the way something was made. The biggest change operationally for us, currently, when someone has used a plant pest to genetically engineer an organism, you have to get a permit to import it, move it interstate, or plant it out of doors, or use it out of doors if it's a microorganism or an arthropod or something like that. And we don't do a risk assessment ahead of that. We just say, okay, you meet the definition, you're regulated. And the only way to get out from under regulation is to go through a petition process. We want to move to analyze first and only regulate when appropriate. We expect this to be substantial regulatory relief because most of the things that we're regulating now, we don't expect to be regulating in the future. There's a lot of reasons for why we want to do this. We have 29 years of experience regulating this stuff. We've learned an awful lot about where plant pest risk comes from and where it doesn't come from. Plant Protection Act, the USDA Office of Inspector General, kind of internal affairs for USDA. They've done 2 audits over the past 11 years, and in both cases, they said you really need to update your regs. They said a bunch of other stuff, but that's the thing I'm latching on right now. They want us to update our regs. The 2008 Farm Bill wants us to make changes to our regulations, and we want to focus on organisms that pose a risk to plant health. And like I said, we want to analyze things first before we require permits. So the supporting documents, before we can finalize all of this, and we are years away, is we already published a notice of intent to conduct a draft programmatic environmental impact statement. Sorry, that's a mouthful, but that's something that I have to do or else I'm not obeying the law. We have to evaluate the environmental impacts of our rule change. We did the notice of intent. We had a public comment period from February 5 to April 21, and the next thing that happens is we publish the draft programmatic environmental impact statement. We have done our regulatory economic impact analysis. We have done our civil rights impact analysis. We've done our tribal impact assessment. And we have created a new weed risk assessment tool. It's currently under external review, being led by USDA's ORCIBA, Office of Risk Assessment and Cost Benefit Analysis. We've done several weed risk assessments, and we have started a regulatory registry. So the way that we expect to operate in the future is we will keep on our webpage a list of organisms that have been evaluated and a listing of whether they will continue to require a permit or they don't require a permit. And it will be very different from the kind of things that we have now. So all of these things, many of them are done, but we have to finish all of those before we can publish our draft EIS and our proposed rule. So back to the notice of intent for the EIS, we published in our notice of intent that we were going to analyze 3 alternatives. No action, which is a requirement of the law. You always have to consider, okay, what if we don't change the regs at all? Our current thinking, which you're going to hear a little bit more about in a few minutes. A proposal that we heard very strongly during our public comment period, regulate all GE organisms forever. Don't ever deregulate anything. And the 4th one, which was to eliminate the biotech regs, which was a serious proposal that we made. You may notice this to be kind of a bookend situation. Regulate everything, regulate nothing that's GE. Our current thinking is in the middle. We dropped that last alternative based on lack of support during the public comment period and based on difficulties that it could create with other APHIS regulations. So the new regulations, I'm highlighting this as our current thinking, and here's why. We have not yet published our proposed rule. It's in clearance. We have already made changes to our current thinking. I'd like to think of most of them as minor changes, but what actually gets published as a proposed rule may look a little different from what I'm going to show you right now. I already mentioned we want to move from regulate first, analyze later to analyze first and regulate when the risk can be documented. We anticipate in the future having a broader review of organisms, and that's technically regulation. If you have to come in and ask us, is this regulated? That's technically regulation, so that's broad, but only require further regulation in the form of movement controls after we have documented what the risks to plant health are. So we've already looked at all of the 123 that we've already granted non-regulated status for. We would not regulate any of those in the future, either under plant pest or noxious weed authority. We want to make it risk-based. Key changes, new scope. The way that we anticipate modifying the plant pest trigger, and I want to point out that this is a review trigger, different from what we have now. Now keep in mind that our current trigger is 3 different ways that a plant pest could be involved, either as a donor or a recipient of DNA, or the organism itself as a plant pest. We want to drop the whole vectoring as a trigger for anything. 5 minutes, thank you. We want to add our noxious weed review trigger, and we're going to provide some exemptions from regulation. New definition of genetic engineering, I'll show you on the next slide. We want to eliminate current notifications, courtesy permits, and our current version of petitions for non-regulated status. So here's our current thinking on what we want our new definition of genetic engineering to be. It's pretty simple. Techniques that use recombinant or synthetic nucleic acids to create or modify a genome. Pretty simple. Now we get to the accepts. It does not include traditional plant breeding techniques, including marker-assisted breeding or chemical or irradiation-based mutagenesis. So the plant pest review trigger, all GE plant pests, only when the donor is a plant pest if the material that the plant pest is donating causes plant disease symptoms or injury. Oops. And GE microorganisms that are modified for altered plant interactions. That's subtle. It's got to have a plant interaction before it's even considered. The noxious weed trigger, all GE plants, unless we've already analyzed it, and unless they've been exempted already. Here are the exemptions. Specific changes, and this is another subtle one, specific changes that could be obtained through the use of chemical or radiation-based mutagenesis. So think of all the things you could get with chemical or radiation-based mutagenesis, and think about some of these modern breeding techniques that are a different way to get the same endpoint. Cisgenesis, if the only change is an assertion from a sexually compatible relative, you could get that with traditional breeding. We're not going to worry about that so much. And there's a lot of these new approaches like early flowering, where you genetically engineer an organism to have a trait for a while, and then you choose the null segregant that doesn't have the inserted DNA. The regulatory status evaluation or reconsideration, we plan to do a risk assessment for each of those, and we'll publish that in a Federal Register. And the last 2 slides, I believe. At the same time, the Executive Office of the President has told us to review the coordinated framework that was published in 1986. So we're working on that very closely now. We have drafts of the updated coordinated framework that have just cleared USDA for further work by OSTP, and the intent is to publish that early September for public comment. Okay, so no questions now, sorry.
For those of you who came in a little bit later, just to reiterate, we'll be taking questions after the third speaker. Each speaker has 20 minutes, and so hopefully we'll be able to have about 15 minutes for questions. Our next speaker is Chuck Divan, who's the Unit Director for Agricultural Select Agent Services, USDA-APHIS. And the title is Agriculture Select Agent Services, Progress Through Change. So, Mike, or Chuck, I'm sorry.
We're all from APHIS, we look alike. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm a little further ahead, or our program's a little further ahead than BRS. We have published a proposed rule for the select agent regulations. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We got comments back, and now the final rule is in departmental clearance in both HHS and USDA. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the final rule. We hope to get it published in the autumn of this year. It should be published before the election. We're going to talk a little bit about the revision of the select agent list as it pertains to plant pathogens. Text revisions for consistency was also put into it. And then there's a new requirement which kind of came from some of the audits we had within the federal government for events and incidences that occurred. And so we're putting in new language for requirements of inactivation of select agents. And then the other thing that I'm going to talk about is our new inspection report structure. That actually went into effect Monday. It's a new formal process which allows the entity to contest inspection findings after they've received the inspection report. There is a dramatic change in the report function format. There are appendices associated with the inspection report. And then at the end of the report, each entity gets a report card which illustrates how it compares to entities of similar complexity and overall within the select agent program. Okay, so the final rule, and since it is still in clearance, I can't talk specifically about everything that's in the final rule, but since these were put into the proposed rule and we got no comments that said we should not remove them, we are removing P. philippinensis and its equivalent P. saccharoi, which are pathogens of corn. And we're also removing Phoma glycinicola, which is a soybean pathogen. The reasons for the removal were presented in the proposed rule. For the proposed inactivation requirements, the new requirement is that you have an accepted or standard validation method, that you validated that method in your lab, in your setting, with your people, your equipment, your reagents. Anytime you've modified the procedure, you've revalidated it, and that over time you periodically revalidate the inactivation protocols and methods, and that you have a written inactivation method and results of that method, and that they can be made available to the Federal Select Agent Program upon request. These aren't things that we're going to be asking for specifically during an inspection or before an inspection, but periodically we may just say, what kind of techniques are you using for inactivation of select agents? Not every entity does inactivation. But if you do, what's your protocol? We'd like to see the results of those inactivations. And of course, this is all based on recent events that occurred over the last couple years that had major implications from the Department of the Army and at CDC. Okay. This, you don't have to read this, but this is the paragraph that's in the inspection letter. And it describes how an entity can dispute a particular inspection finding. You have 14 days to send in writing a dispute of the finding, documenting it with as much information as you can. Those disputes come to me and to my counterpart at the CDC. We review them. We make a determination whether the request is justifiable or not, and write a letter back to the entity, again, within a specified period of time. These do not get reviewed by the people that wrote them or the file owners who are responsible for an entity. We found that people get very close to findings that they've identified, and if they're challenged on them, they just don't have a clear non-conflict of interest response. So it comes to the directors, we review it, and make a determination. Okay, so here's the new format. And this format was based on webinar information we've gotten back, feedback from the regulated community, as well as some of the training sessions we've done, independent letter writing back from the entity. It would be nice if we saw this. So the new format is there'll be a cover letter, followed by an appendix 1, which is the list of entity departures, and then appendix 2, general concerns noted. If it refers to an amendment, there may be concerns regarding an amendment. Requests for additional clarification or information. Any issues under review that would be beneficial to the entity. And then at the end, an entity report card. One thing I'd like to note is that the types of inspections that we conduct are a new registration. They're just getting into the select agent program. A renewal of a registration. An amendment to the registration which involves changing in either agents, protocols, rooms, etc. And in fact, or an amendment where the physical plant of the facility has changed. So those are the type of inspections that we would be writing this report for. Okay. Another thing that we've done in the inspection report, we're telling the entity that we've identified departures from the regulations, and now we're telling the entity what we think those departures or how those departures rank, serious, moderate, or low. That's another thing that we got from the regulated community. They wanted to know if things were bad or good. And that being the case, our current database, when it prepares the report, it just lists them in order of the CFR section, so 9, 11, 12, 15, and doesn't indicate any kind of severity or concern. So we've got a new tool we've developed which will put the departures from the regulation from highest to lowest, and each departure will be tagged with whether it's serious or not. So it's a threefold process here. You'll have the requirement from the Federal Register from the CFR regulations. You'll have the observation that was noted by the inspector at the time of the visit. And then an additional new added point is we will tell the entity what they need to do to correct the departure. That was another thing that people asked us up front to do. What we were doing before was we'd have the requirement, we'd have the observation, and then we kind of left it up to the entity to decide how to correct that. And so that delayed the finalization of the inspections because they would come back with something that we thought was not right or inadequate or whatever. So this way we have a more upfront, proactive approach. We're telling them exactly what they need to do to correct it. And each one of these severity levels, the moderate and the low, will have the same requirement, observation and corrective action. You may get a report that has no serious, they're all minor or they're all moderate. That will be indicated on this appendix. Okay, general concerns. There may be a reason that we want to get additional information, or we've seen some things that kind of bother us. There may not approach the level of regulatory departure, but we wanted to make a note to the entity that that is possible. Or the report will say Appendix 2 is not applicable. So the report will always have all appendices in. It will be indicated whether that particular appendices is applicable to this particular inspection. And again here, if this is an inspection regarding renewal or a new entity, there would be no amendment issues, so Appendix 3 would not be applicable. That would only be applicable for an inspection requiring an amendment to the registration. And then again, request for additional information. This is more information that we may need. This usually refers to the physical plant. We may need security printouts of people accessing particular areas, or if there was any kind of maintenance done to the mechanical systems. We may want to look at those while we're analyzing our inspection findings. And again, if there is nothing to add here, we would put in Appendix 4 is not applicable. This is kind of a heads up. We can tell the entity. In addition to the inspection we did, we're also looking at these issues that we've noted in previous inspections or through previous emails. Again, if it's not applicable, it won't be published. And then the thing I think that most entities will find very important is the entity report card. And I hope the shows up better. What this is a statistical overview of the inspection findings. So the green box up there says what kind of inspection it is. The colored bars indicate the level of concerns. We also have the areas that were inspected. And then the third little box talks about the percentage of departures. So you have 25% in security, you have 25% in RO oversight or whatever. It gives you an idea of kind of your failings within the regulatory structure. I think the last bar is going to be more beneficial to everyone, and that indicates to the entity, here's your current inspection report, here are the departures. I can't remember which colors are which, but one color indicates for entities that are very similar to yourself, and we've done that through through an entity evaluation, and we've identified entities based on complexity. If you have an entity that's all BSL-2 labs, it might have a complexity of 1. If you have an entity that has BSL-4, BSL-3, a lot of agents, it would have a higher complexity of 5. That said, this graph gives you an idea of how you relate to entities within your classification and also with entities overall. Now, this is fake data, so this doesn't refer to any one entity, but it would give them a snapshot of how they relate to their peers in the program and how they relate overall to all the entities within the program. And one thing to go back to the dispute part, if a dispute is found to be valid, we will then reissue the inspection report, and then these statistics will change. So it's kind of like if you've been given a black mark and we've decided that that was an inadvertent black mark, it'll come off your record, and you will see a change in both the report and in the report card. And then this is just our website. It has all the current information, our regulations, our proposals. It has links to all the essaygrams we've sent out to the regulated community describing changes in the program, et cetera. And it also has our guidance documents and the inspection checklists that the inspectors use when they go out on inspections. And those checklists are again done by the CFR regulations, sections like RO, security, BSL2, BSL3, those sort of things. So all the information is there. And if you need to talk to me, feel free to call the AgSAS main line, and they will get me a message if I'm not in the office, and I'll get back in touch with you. So thanks.
Okay, our final presentation. We're going to shift gears a little bit here. We've talked about the regulators, and Mike talking about area of the biotechnology, and Chuck in terms of permitting for select agents and so forth. But what we're going to do now is move into the perspective of the regulated. I'm going to introduce Bruce Houtman, who is the leader of the crop protection regulatory group for AgroSciences. The crop protection in AgroSciences vernacular means the agrochemicals, as opposed to the biotechnology area. And Bruce is going to give his perspective as somebody who's been doing this for a number of years and has been working through a number of issues. And the title is Perspective and Update on the U.S. Crop Protection Regulatory Landscape. And as I mentioned earlier, after his presentation, the three speakers will come up here, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. Okay?
Dave, thank you very much. My name is Bruce Houtman. I've been with the company for a long time and have worked in this area for a long time. I will paint in broad brushes here and really work through three main areas. One is, what is the U.S. crop protection regulatory landscape? How is it built? How does it work? What are the engines that drive it? And then the second and third are factors today which are new and impactful, and that is litigation and the Endangered Species Act. So the federal authority in the U.S. is the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Pesticide Program. That's their building under the leadership of a guy named Jack Hausinger, who I remember right, is in his 40th year with that program. He runs an organization, I think, of about 800 people, mostly scientists, who do their work very well. They're very experienced, very well-developed regulatory authority who've been doing their work for a very long time. Jack reports to a gentleman by the name of Jim Jones, who is the assistant administrator. He actually has devoted most of his career to this same area, so a very well-led, experienced organization. They do their work aligned with the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, we call that FIFRA, and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, we call that FFTCA. The first one is about entitling the use of these pesticides. The second is the authority that allows the residues of these pesticides to be imparted on food. All pesticide products need to be registered at the state level, but for today we'll really focus on the federal process. If you were to develop a new fungicide product today and have it be a broad spectrum, broadly used product, you would spend about $40 million developing the data that is required by FIFRA and Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. $40 million to really do conduct about 400 studies. If you look at all those studies and pile them together, you'll find they consist of about 75,000 pages of information. Not sure if you've ever seen 75,000 pages of information, but those are the two people for one of our more recent submissions are sitting on and around the boxes that consist of that submission. Now, I'm fooling you a little bit. actually the EPA accepts electronic submissions, so it actually all does fit on a DVD, but there are some authorities in the world that still require these paper submissions. But you box them up, you send them in, and then the authority's job is to review them. They have to review all those studies and draw their own conclusions. They critique them and they interpret them. And if they find them to be acceptable and meet the standard, that product, that petition is suitable for consideration for registration. Under FIFRA and the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, everything boils down to these two simple statements. Under FIFRA, there can be no unreasonable adverse effects, and under FFDCA, there has to be a reasonable certainty of no harm. Emphasize the words unreasonable and reasonable. It depends. What's considered to be acceptable from a risk standpoint depends on the benefits, the societal or the agronomic benefits that that new technology represents. That is comfortably vague. That allows there to be a discussion which involves many stakeholders and many points of view so that the Environmental Protection Agency can reach the right conclusions. It is a risk versus benefit, risk management regulatory framework that draws relative comparisons against new and existing technologies. And it brings in, as I mentioned, diverse stakeholders and perspectives. That's a kind way to say some of the things that actually occur during public comment periods that are opened up as part of this regulatory decision making. But again, the key points here is there is not an absolute black and white criteria for acceptability. It depends, the benefits and the risks are balanced. That's how it works. It's been working that way for the last 40 some odd years, and it works very well, to be quite honest with you. It's very, like I say, a very well developed, mature regulatory framework. So, what's new? It's not that litigation is new. Litigation has been around this process for a very long time, but what is new is the outcome of this litigation. So I've got, first of all, focus on the right-hand side of that slide. When the EPA registers a new technology, a new fungicide product, every single time now they face litigation. The litigation is raised or brought forward by some of the groups that are highlighted here at the bottom of this slide. And most commonly, they use the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco as the place where this plays out, the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco, where the voices at the bottom of that figure believe their views will resonate best. I think that's their logic. And the EPA's job is to defend the decision that they just made. Often the registrant will also intervene, but it really lies at the feet of the EPA to defend the decisions that they made. You can imagine if you were running the Office of Pesticide Program, the amount of time that you would spend making that decision is extended when you recognize you have to defend that decision against the opposition described here. It affects, so the litigation not just affects the outcome, it can, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. It also affects the process that the agency runs and the timelines over which they run it. If you look at the left-hand side, you'll see how that affects the regulatory timelines the EPA has. The black chart is, inside term is PREA, but imagine that being the goal. The goal is to get these things done in 2 years, a new active ingredient. And you can see the 4 fiscal years previous and what their average timeline is. They never meet the goal. They don't meet the goal not because they're not capable or they are not trying their best to do it. It's because they now have to prepare for other obstructions to this process. The most important one is litigation. I'll give you one example or share with you one example that is specific to our company. A new insecticide product, sulfoxaflor, was registered in 2013. On the 59th day following registration, litigation was filed. I don't remember the organization's name, but the litigation claimed that the EPA was not properly protecting pollinators when it registered that product. When it registered that product and determined the right label restrictions and the use directions, the litigants, the petitioners said that the EPA was not properly protecting pollinators. Filed in the Ninth Circuit Court, And in the Ninth Circuit Court, September of last year, agreed. They chose to, this is a 3-judge panel in the Ninth Circuit Court, elected to disagree on the science with the Environmental Protection Agency about how to properly protect pollinators. That is, in our world, a paradigm shift that's extraordinary. The registrants invest in new technologies. They take them to the regulatory authority for their review and their conclusion, and if things work and are suitable, registration. That's no longer the case anymore. Now both the registrant and the authority look to, in most cases, the Ninth Circuit Court for the ultimate outcome. And in this case, the Ninth Circuit Court vacated that registration, which required EPA to cancel it. That required EPA and Dow AgroSciences, our company, to work with them for new uses, a resurrected registration, which is now under review, which brings back a comment period. In this case, 60,000 comments were received. 100 were in favor, by the way. 100 of those 60,000 comments thought a new insecticide product on behalf of the American farmer was a great idea. The others didn't. The third topic, so the regulatory framework, the general topic of litigation. Let me be specific with you and tie these together, if I can, with the Endangered Species Act. You're familiar with the Endangered Species Act. You've heard of the Endangered Species Act. I want to tell you how the Endangered Species Act can affect the American farmer and the development and the sustainability of these new technologies. Endangered Species Act, if you go to the EPA's website, you'll see these words. This is at the EPA. But recognize, first of all, EPA does not own the Endangered Species Act. Unlike FIFRA and the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, which are EPA and FDA, there's a federal family. I think that's the term of art. There's a federal family, which are all stakeholders in the administration of the Endangered Species Act. But the words that I've highlighted in red, I want you to read and contrast to what was in FIFRA, where we talked about things being unreasonable or reasonable. Here they are absolute. Zero threshold is the important part of the Endangered Species Act. Zero threshold for any effect or potential effect on listed species or their habitat is the standard. Very, very different. So, walk through this. The science necessary to anticipate environmental exposures and environmental risks are very well developed, right? We use them under FIFRA, and we work with the EPA on those every single day. So predicting and measuring offsite exposures and risks is a very well developed area of science. We know exactly where the farm fields are. If you go to Google Earth, you'll see exactly where the farm fields are. Where listed threatened or endangered species are, and their habitat are also very well developed. Now, that information is held confidential, but where these species are, where the farms are very well understood. So here's where the challenge starts. There are times when the applications of these technologies, crop protection technologies, the ecological footprint can exceed the boundaries of the field. There's different mechanisms, there's different transport mechanisms which take these technologies and allow them in some cases to exceed the boundaries. You can see those listed there, and you can see some of the other details associated. The impact of the technology, if you do an assessment, an exposure and risk assessment, can exceed the boundaries of the field. And if those fields are in areas where these threatened or endangered species are, or where their habitats are, you may have an effect. And remember, the terms of the Endangered Species Act are absolute. There's a zero threshold for the potential for these types of effects. You can't see that well, but that's a shot, I think a satellite shot of somewhere in the Midwest. The green and the yellow are corn and soybean fields. The red shapes show you where some particular endangered species are known to exist. I think the one on the bottom left, it is a particularly endangered rattlesnake, and there's a particularly endangered plant in the upper right. That information is understood, and you can imagine if you're a landowner inside that red area versus a landowner outside that red area, the value of your land, the freedom to operate, ultimately could be profoundly affected. That's one of the barriers, by the way, to having a solution that's brought forward that makes sense for all stakeholders, is the impact this will have on American farming. So I've described for you the problems of litigation. The best obstruction using litigation today is when the opposition uses the Endangered Species Act, because it's so simple. The intersection between farming and the Endangered Species Act is a difficult one, given the way these technologies are being used, given the way the assessments are being conducted. The litigation being filed against EPA has now reached every new active ingredient. Every new active ingredient faces litigation, and it's usually Endangered Species Act driven litigation. I think DuPont back in 2014 had the first new active ingredient that faced this type of litigation. And I don't believe that's in the Ninth Circuit Court. I think that's in the DC Court. I think those oral arguments will be happening this year. That's why I've got 2016. But that will be the first new active ingredient which is going to run into this issue in litigation. So that's new registrations, companies investing in new technologies and bringing those forward. What I skipped over earlier was the fact under FIFRA, all technologies have to go through re-registration or registration review every 15 years. It's a requirement. It's a fundamental requirement of FIFRA. And now in this cycle, it's a 15-year cycle, EPA Office of Pesticide Program are running their compounds, all compounds, through this ESA assessment in registration review. And they've started with 3 pilot active ingredients. They're all insecticides, chlorpyrifos, diazine, and malathion. The 3 pilot active ingredients, just to see if they can do this, and do this in coordination with the other government agencies, most importantly, the Department of Interior Services, if you will. That consultation, that coordination is being worked on currently. I'll point out that the EPA, now 3 or 4 months ago, released their draft biological evaluation for these 3 pilot active ingredients. And it took them 2 years and resulted in about 30,000 pages of information describing their assessment for these 3 active ingredients. So in registration review, the current approach is to do that type of evaluation. So the conclusion is, at least the draft conclusion is that American farming, because this really isn't about these specific active ingredient, it's more about the impact these types of technologies, whether they're fungicides, insecticides, or herbicides, can have when they're used. The conclusion is that American farming may be affecting up to 80 to 97% of threatened or endangered species in the U.S. And that's just the way that is. Now, the Office of Pesticide Program has taken 2 years and 30,000 pages for these 3 assessments. If you look at the number of products they've got to work through, it's 743. That's not going to work. They don't know how it's going to work yet, but it's not going to work. So what we'll find is that litigation, number one, is impactful broadly, but Endangered Species Act and the litigation that's associated with it is starting to have a very direct and impactful effect on these technologies and the regulatory process occurring currently at the federal level. So DuPont's day in court with Cyazypyr, that was the new insecticide registered, will be occurring later this year. The deadline for the 3 pilot active ingredients to make it all the way through the endangered species assessment process with the services, I think, is the end of next year. So there's very important things whose timeline is now that will reach a conclusion sometime starting by the end of this year and on to the next. So one last slide, just to kind of revisit this. A very well-developed regulatory process is run for crop protection technologies in the U.S. The Endangered Species Act, when it was developed in 1973, really didn't leave a very good place for farmers to farm in areas where endangered species in their habitat exist. There is no practical answer. A practical answer has to be developed. Now, you can look at reopening the Endangered Species Act. That's not easy to do. There's other ways to go about doing this, but that really is an important problem that has to be solved. The stakeholders have disparate views of this issue, but it's something that's going to have to be solved moving forward over the next couple of years. And it's very clearly that litigation is the tool of those who oppose these technologies in farming. And they've had a very successful strategy that's built around, frankly, using the Ninth Circuit Court, who has, in the last 2 years, begun removing or canceling, vacating some of these technologies. So what's important? I mentioned in the U.S., the regulatory framework is risk and benefit. Voices of understanding need to be brought forward. Those voices belong to you. Those voices belong to other stakeholders in American farming and in these industries that need to make sure that the benefits of these technologies are understood, that new technologies continue to be developed, and that they get supported not just in the regulatory process, but in some of these processes that follow. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, we've got quite a bit of time, I think, about 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. I've asked the three speakers to come up here, and I think logistically, though, because of the way this is being live streamed, if you do have a question, you may have to come up to the podium here. But what I would ask is if you do have a question, please use the mic that's available, and please address your question to one of the three speakers. And if there's any ambiguity about the question, I might ask them to repeat the question. But anyway, we've got time, so please ask questions.
My question is for Bruce. Do the organic compounds, or the compounds that are considered to be organically approved, do they have to go through this process as well?
Short answer is yes. Independent of how the technology, where it comes from or how it got there, these are technologies that are determined to have an effect. They have to go through the same assessment process and reach the same conclusions, whether they're organic or traditionally manufactured. So yeah, the same requirements are in place.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Mike Firko, please. Mike, with the direction that the BRS is taking, what are your plans regarding GE biocontrol organisms?
So I don't anticipate using different criteria for genetically engineered biocontrol organisms than have been used over the past decades for not genetically engineered biocontrol organisms. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but when we do our evaluations, we are almost always comparing a genetically engineered organism against the non-genetically engineered counterpart to see if there are any additional risks that have been created through the process of genetic engineering. So any risks that would be presented by the biocontrol organism that's not genetically engineered would be part of the consideration as well. And if there are any additional, if any traits have been added through genetic engineering that increase the virulence or dispersal or whatever, those would be considered as well. We in the Biotech program haven't done very much with genetically engineered biological control organisms, but that's because not too many have been presented to us. Marjorie Hoy had a genetically engineered mite. Goodness, I think that's 25 years ago or now. We have been regulating a diamondback moth, a genetically engineered diamondback moth in New York. It's a female lethality trait. It's not one organism killing another, it's a population control mechanism. But I don't see any reason to treat them any differently if they're genetically engineered. You consider all of the risks of the base organism and then any additional risks that have been created.
I have a question for Chuck. Could you just, and it's mostly for clarification, I think you said something about the methods of inactivation. When you mean inactivation, you mean just killing, or is it inactivating to reactivate later?
Okay, and this is a question about the terminology of inactivation. We went round and round with terminology. As with anything in science, everybody's got a different take on the term. When we're talking about inactivation, we really mean sterilization. It's non-lethal. So, I'm sorry, it's lethal, so it's no longer viable. So when the regs say inactivation, that's what we're talking about. Now, we will have a definition, and that's what we've decided to do in the final rule, which describes how we're going to regulate the term inactivation. But it really means that you are killing the organism so that there's no way that it can revive.
I'm not sure if this is a question for Mike or for Bruce, so bear with me. We were talking, I guess you're talking, Bruce, about the different standards by which you can measure a new product or an old product, whether it's a relative risk or an absolute kind of thing. And I'm curious, when you do the environmental assessments, the tribal assessments, the weediness assessments, are these factoring in the Endangered Species Act? And do they measure like the relative risks, or are these more absolute?
Recently, in the last couple of years, the EPA and USDA jointly approved a technology that our company brought forward called Enlist. I think you might have worked on Enlist directly. And the idea is to have a herbicide-resistant trait in a herbicide developed specifically to manage that. And really, it's all about managing resistant weeds. That's that's the engine behind that technology. And I can tell you that the EPA, on the herbicide side, determined they would not move forward with that herbicide approval unless they could reach what's called a no-effect determination under the Endangered Species Act. Right? That took 2 extra years for us to get to the finish line, but we did develop an outcome that not only accommodated the Endangered Species Act, but actually reached a no-effect determination. That was very important to the EPA that we were able to do that. Now, that makes it the only herbicide. I think Monsanto's got a herbicide which is proposed for that same status, but I can tell you that became a really, really important thing, at least on the herbicide side.
My mind went several different places with your question. One is, let's just look at the difference between the statutory authority in EPA and USDA. EPA has explicit authority to look at a cost-benefit analysis type of thing. In the Plant Protection Act, not so much. Now, that said, although EPA is exempt from the National Environmental Policy Act, so when they take an action, their reviews are considered, I forget what word is, but it's considered consistent with and sufficient. You know what the word is?
No.
Yeah, it's.
But you're describing it right.
Yeah, they don't have to do NEPA because the analyses they do are considered to be the same thing. In USDA, whenever we make any decision that is considered a significant decision, and it would be issuance of a permit for a plant pathogen or deregulation of a genetically engineered arthropod or plant or whatever, we have to do a NEPA analysis, National Environmental Policy Act. The thing about NEPA, though, is that it's a procedural statute. It doesn't affect your decision per se. So our decision in Biotech is based strictly on our authority, the Plant Protection Act. okay? And it's going to be based on, is the thing a plant pest or a noxious weed? When we do our NEPA analysis, the procedure that we have to follow is an environmental analysis. No particular outcome is expected, no particular outcome is required, and the only way it affects our actions is that if we do an environmental assessment, which is sort of the middle level of environmental analysis, if we are not able to reach what's called a finding of no significant impact, then we have to do an environmental impact statement, which is a larger analysis. But once you do the environmental impact statement, I mean, APHIS has done EISs on aerial spraying of malathion in neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Now, is there a potential for impact on humans there? Absolutely. But did that stop the program from going? No, because the environmental impact statement was done, the impacts were acknowledged, and a decision was made to go ahead and control Mediterranean fruit fly in that case. And that's true across USDA programs. NEPA is procedural. And you do look at costs and benefits in a NEPA analysis, but that doesn't affect our decision under the Plant Protection Act. I hope I didn't complicate things there, but it's a complicated issue, yeah.
So I have a question that I think is probably for Chuck. So as we look at more and more interest by industry in developing biologicals, we can anticipate that there may be a point at which having products that have uncultivated organisms present may be a component. And I'm just wondering if you can give some comments on what some of the issues are or solutions to those issues.
Well, as Mike said, we're looking at things like CRISPR throughout USDA and also at the CDC, because it does offer a unique way of getting to a point in genetic modification that wasn't available earlier. That said, it kind of goes back to this inactivation. If you have DNA which is infectious and it's from a select agent, that would be regulated. But if you have DNA that you've inactivated or removed the infectious part of, then that portion that no longer is infectious is no longer regulated as a select agent. So going downfield with this, as technologies develop, you could go from a select agent to a non-select agent very quickly in the new technologies. That said, if you need to maintain a positive control that is a viable select agent, then you're still going to be regulated. But we are analyzing that. We have, we call it, there are two groups, ISATAC and Ag-ISATAC. They're interagency subject matter expert technical assistant committees, which help us through the use of SMEs throughout the federal government to identify those kind of new technologies, whether or not this has become a select, has gone from a select agent to a non-select agent due to those kind of issues.
So I was actually thinking outside the context of select agents, sorry
Okay.
for that. I was thinking more in terms of microbial releases. When you have microbial permits right now, and it's an identified organism, if you have an identified microbial organism or a community of organisms that maybe work well together, but many of them are not yet identified, does that pose problems that are going to come up down the road for regulation?
Okay, so again, it kind of goes back to, if you have an unknown, we can't regulate it unless there's some specific reason that it appears to be a plant pest. So that was kind of like what Mike was saying. We do have these species complexes, which on a regulatory basis really cause us a lot of grief because we can't specifically identify either the organism and or the trait. But if they have a plant pest risk, then they're going to be regulated. But there will come a time as technologies develop that we'll be able to parse that apart and identify what is the plant pest and what is non-plant pest in this group. And I think Mike wants to add something here.
Well,
Well, we actually have somebody from the pest permitting unit that could talk about that if you'd
Wanna
like.
have Jorge?
Abad.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can he be heard on that microphone, or does he need to come up here?
Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay.
Yeah. That's fine. I can just.
Why don't you come up here and, yeah. Now, actually, Jorge is really the more expert on this.
Well, thank you. I think this question is in the context of what we were talking about yesterday, phytobiomes, and then all the new organisms that are being discovered. The unknowns. If you want to do research with the unknowns, you have to have a permit. As a matter of fact, if you want to move those unknowns, but you found those unknowns in your own location, you don't need a permit for that. If you find plant pathogens or biocontrollers, and then somebody, or you're planning to move those around the country or exporting those, then whoever is requesting those organisms that have to have a permit from anywhere in the USA. I'm not aware of the different countries abroad, but I think we have a unique system of permitting. But if you have, the basis is if you have a plant pathogen or a biocontrol and it needs to be moved to another state, whoever is requesting that, they will need a permit. So that is, would that answer your question, or? Okay.
We're just about out of time, but we have time for another question or two. We can stay here as long as you want.
I have a question about the select agent list. You said there were 3 things taken off, and so I wondered how things came off and on. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a group of subject matter experts that we put together. They're from all parts of USDA, and the plant side of the Federal Select Agent Program convenes them. It takes us about 18 months. We have to look at the list every 2 years, so we're going to be publishing the new rule this fall. Next spring, early summer, we will be convening this group again. What we've done in the past, and this seems to work pretty well, is we take the list from APS for new emerging pathogens. We also look at about 290 known plant pathogens, and we then get economic analysis on how pathogenic they are to certain commodities. We use the minimum 5 billion rule, so that excludes a lot of smaller crops like almonds and plums and grapes and things like that. And so the commodities really are rice, corn, wheat, those sort of things, because not only do we look at domestic production, we also look at export. So that said, we then pare this list down. We do a risk analysis based on about 20 criteria that we've developed. The broad-based criteria are in the statute, and those are also put into our regs on what we look at. But then we parse that out into a more detailed identification of risk and biology. We give it a score of 1 to 10. As we whittle it down, we try and get down to about 20 organisms the first cut, because that's a manageable number. From that point, then we take that 20 and we do another analysis. We have criteria that has been given to us by the FBI for organisms that have been modified and used as bioweapons in the past. We score that criteria against these. Many of them have, in fact, been bioweaponized, not since the 60s and 70s, but That was something that some of these agents have gone through. And then we rank them and look at the scores and make a determination through the group on the ones that should stay and the ones that should go. And if they should go, what are the criteria that we're going to use to delist them? One of the criteria we used for the organisms, the P. philippinensis and P. saccharoi, was that there are no viable organisms currently in the U.S. They're very difficult to grow. They require in planta. You need a pretty experienced understanding of both the biology of the organism and how to inoculate and infect plants. The plants need to have a certain level of heat and humidity for the organism to grow properly. So it's just not, it turns out that it's just not a very good agent. They will still be regulated by Jorge's group when they come off as a plant pest. And so people that want to bring them in will still need a movement permit, but they won't be regulated as a select agent. Yes, and of course, then this goes out for public comment in the proposed rule. And as I said earlier, we got no negative comments about removing these particular agents. So that's why I was able to mention them today. And the thing with the FOMA, it's a soybean pathogen. When it first went on, there were no herbicides, there were no fungicides in the U.S. that could fight an infection of this. There are currently now approved fungicides, so we have a mechanism to either eliminate or eradicate it if it shows up in soybean. So that's why that one came off. But we do look at things like, are there pesticide, chemical insecticides, whatever we need, the biology of the organism, regulatory constraints, both international and national. So it's a pretty laborious process, and for those of you that may have been on these committees, you know it's 2 or 3 meetings every week for like 18 months, and a lot of emails back and forth. And anyway, so I hope that answered your question.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. I'd like to thank the 3 speakers.